The screams have stopped, but the crowd remains. In a chamber beneath the stones of a medieval citadel, something waits in the flickering candlelight. It glimmers like armor, but whispers like a coffin. Curved metal shaped to a woman's frame. Iron ridges polished not for protection, but for punishment. This was never meant to kill quickly. The device clings to the outline of the female body, every curve designed for maximum agony. Each spike positioned with surgical precision. Each lock crafted to ensure there's no escape. The watching crowd presses closer, their faces lit by torchlight, hungry for the spectacle about to unfold. Because this isn't about justice. This is about sending a message. One carved into flesh, written in screams, and performed for an audience that mistakes cruelty for righteousness. You're looking at the Iron Maiden. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. It was never just about execution. It was about theater, about transforming a human being into a living warning that said one thing above all else: your body doesn't belong to you. Today, we're going inside the darkest chapter of medieval punishment to uncover the truth behind these instruments of torture. And I'm warning you now, what you're about to learn will change how you see medieval justice forever.
To understand how such instruments could exist, we must descend into the world that demanded them. Medieval Europe was not governed by fairness. It was governed by fear, by sermons, by a hierarchy where women stood firmly at the bottom. From pulpit to courtroom, the lesson was repeated: women were weak, unstable, born of sin. Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden was no simple story. It was a curse that echoed through every century. Because she sought knowledge, all women were condemned as tempters, gateways to corruption. The church preached it, the law enforced it, and society absorbed it until it became truth. If a woman could tempt, she must be restrained. If she could defy, she must be broken. Feudal law offered little shelter. A man might pay a fine for his violence. A woman could face the whip, the brand, or worse. Her crime could be as simple as speaking too boldly, resisting a marriage, or being accused of immorality by a jealous neighbor. The very essence of female independence, sexuality, speech, or choice, was recast as a threat to divine order itself. And so the instruments of iron were born. They were not only about pain, they were about power. Among the most feared was a device shaped like the claws of a beast, the breast ripper. 4 curved talons of iron, sometimes heated until they glowed red, fastened onto a handle. In a single movement, they tore flesh from bone. Skin, muscle, and nerve shattered under their grip. Death did not always come immediately. Blood loss, infection, and shame followed. But death was not the primary purpose. The breast ripper was about desecration, the destruction of motherhood itself. Public squares became the stage. A woman accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft was dragged before neighbors, stripped to the waist and tied to a post. Before the eyes of all she had once known, her body was mutilated. Her breasts, the very organs of nurture, were torn away, transforming life into spectacle. A chilling message spread through the crowd: the gift of womanhood could be twisted into her punishment. Chronicles from 14th century Germany recall a woman accused of poisoning her husband. As part of her execution, her breasts were ripped away before she was hanged. Manuals of witch hunting, like the Malleus Maleficarum, recommended punishments that struck at the female form where it was most symbolic. This was not random cruelty. It was ritualized erasure, the transformation of life-giving flesh into a lesson carved in blood. But what if mutilation in public was not enough? What if suffering had to come from within, invisible until screams broke the silence? Then came the pair of anguish, a small device, almost delicate, a hollow bulb of iron shaped like a pear, smooth outside, cruel within. A hidden screw made it bloom open, its metal petals forcing flesh to tear silently, slowly, with each turn. It could be inserted into the mouth, the rectum, or, most often for women, the womb. Turn by turn, the body was invaded. Pain flowered inward, destroying voice, fertility, identity. Sometimes the victim lived, but transformed. A woman could survive only to be left barren or robbed of her voice, forever speaking in broken syllables. Picture the chamber, a stone crypt beneath a monastery. a woman bound on a wooden table. A priest watches, his face unreadable as a torturer turns the screw. Her eyes widen, her mouth opens in a soundless scream until her own body betrays her from within. It was not an execution, it was an erasure. A slow destruction of what men most feared, a woman who could speak, a woman who could choose, a woman who could create. Some punishments were not sudden, brutal strikes of iron, but slow wars of attrition. Among these, the iron corset was perhaps the most insidious. At first glance, it looked almost noble. Plates of darkened steel, polished edges, curved lines that followed the silhouette of a female body. To the untrained eye, it might be mistaken for armor, a shield against violence. But its truth was far darker. This was not made to protect. It was made to imprison. The corset was fashioned from bands of iron that clasped across the ribs, waist, and hips. Screws locked the structure in place, sometimes riveted so it could not be removed without tools. Each breath became a negotiation with pain. Every step pressed metal into tender flesh. Some designs carried spikes set along the inner lining, pressing constantly into skin, reopening wounds again and again until infection set in. Others were weighted with lead, dragging against the spine and compressing the chest until breathing grew shallow. Sleep became an ordeal. The body stiffened into perpetual ache. In time, bones shifted, ribs dislocated, and internal bleeding weakened the victim from within. Unlike the breast ripper or the pair of anguish, this was not a single act of terror. It was a sentence, weeks, sometimes months of living inside a portable prison. Women forced into iron corsets still had to move, cook, sweep, wash, kneel in church pews. Their punishment became invisible, tucked beneath their clothes, though every motion cost them agony. To watch such a woman at market or in the fields was to witness obedience reshaped through suffering. Historical records trace their use across Europe. In France and Italy, young girls were forced into corsets for moral improvement, their bodies quite literally corrected into submission. In parts of Germany, wives judged lazy, defiant, or impure were bound into them at the order of husbands or magistrates. No courtroom was required. No appeal was offered. In many cases, the iron corset was less a punishment for crime than for character, imposed upon daughters too outspoken, brides too resistant, or widows too independent. It was a punishment not of hours but of existence, grinding down the will, and it carried a bitter irony. The corset, long associated with femininity and grace, was transformed into an implement of torment. The very symbol of beauty and poise became a cage. Womanhood itself became the crime. If the corset caged the body, the scold's bridle caged the voice. Forged of iron, it was less a device than a mask of humiliation, a metal frame that encircled the head, straps tightening across the cheeks, jaw, and skull until the wearer's identity dissolved behind cold steel. At its heart lay the cruelest feature, a sharpened spike, curved downward into the mouth, pressing against the tongue. The principle was simple. To speak was to suffer. Every word drove the spike deeper, cutting flesh until blood filled the mouth. The pain silenced not only arguments but laughter, whispers, even the smallest murmur of protest. In some cases, bells were attached to the frame so that each movement rang out, drawing attention to the wearer, turning her into both prisoner and spectacle. Women forced into the bridle were not hidden away in dungeons. They were paraded through marketplaces and town squares, displayed like living warnings. Neighbors watched, children mocked, men jeered, women turned their faces aside in shame or fear. The punishment was not only for the accused. It was for every onlooker who understood the message. The female tongue was dangerous, and silence was survival. The crime that justified this punishment was as vague as it was common. A woman might be accused of scolding, of gossiping, of disturbing church with her voice, or of defying her husband in public. In 16th century Scotland, court records reveal widows muzzled for arguing with neighbors, wives bridled for raising their voices during sermons. In England, similar stories abound. The label scold had no precise meaning. It could fall on any woman whose voice cut too sharp, whose presence unsettled authority. The bridle's cruelty was not merely physical. It attacked the essence of memory and tradition. For centuries, women had been the keepers of oral knowledge, midwives who instructed young brides, healers who passed remedies from mother to daughter, storytellers who preserved the history of villages. To pierce the tongue was to pierce that chain of inheritance, to sever wisdom from the community. When the bridle was finally removed, its scars lingered. Some women never spoke clearly again, their tongues permanently damaged. Others chose silence, fearing the weight of iron might return. What was left was not only a wounded mouth, but a hollowed life, an identity reshaped into silence. The corset and the bridle served different purposes, yet they echoed one another. Both redefined daily existence into spectacle. A woman bound in iron was not only punished, she was displayed. Her body became a lesson. Her silence became a performance. Medieval justice thrived not in shadows, but in theater. Public squares became stages where suffering was scripted into ritual. The crowd was not an accident of geography, it was the audience. Every gasp of pain, every drop of blood, every silent mouth was part of the drama meant to affirm the order of the world. A woman who breathed too freely was caged. A woman who spoke too boldly was muzzled. And everyone who witnessed learned the same line: obedience is survival. The irony was merciless. While men were punished for deeds, theft, treason, heresy, women were punished for being. For speaking, for breathing, for existing outside prescribed boundaries. And so the tools of torment were crafted with exquisite symbolism. The breast ripper targeted nurture. The pair of anguish targeted the womb. The corset targeted breath. The bridle targeted voice. Each iron edge spoke not only to the flesh it scarred, but to the identity it sought to erase, and yet beyond the chains and the gags, a whisper of legend began to circulate. A final device, tall as a woman, lined with spikes, waiting to embrace its victim in a deadly kiss. The Iron Maiden. It loomed in the imagination as the pinnacle of cruelty. But unlike the corset or the bridle, its existence was uncertain. Perhaps it was never real at all. The devices that truly existed were already cruel enough, their iron edges carving obedience into generations of women. Yet, as centuries passed, the myth of an even darker machine grew stronger. A coffin of spikes shaped like a woman, called the Iron Maiden. It is here that history blurs into imagination. But whether real or invented, the maiden carried forward the same message that every corset, every bridle, every claw of iron had already written. The female body was not safe, not sacred, not sovereign. It was clay to be reshaped, flesh to be silenced, iron to be worn like destiny. But the truth is more unsettling. The Iron Maiden, as we know it, may never have existed in the Middle Ages. No court record, no testimony, no executioner's journal confirms its use. The earliest known example appeared not in a medieval dungeon, but in an 18th century museum in Nuremberg, long after the supposed age of torture it was meant to represent. Curators pieced it together from fragments of old sarcophagi and spiked instruments, presenting it as authentic history. Visitors recoiled in fascination. Writers spread its legend across Europe. The Maiden of Iron was born not from cruelty alone, but from spectacle, and yet, as the myth grew, so too did its gendered variations. Iron Maidens shaped with exaggerated curves, breasts molded into the chamber, spikes positioned with obscene precision, appeared in paintings, fiction, and exhibitions. These were never used. They were imagined. But perhaps that made them even more chilling. For they revealed something society could not hide, the fantasy of punishing the female body. What does it mean that we invented a torture device specifically shaped to fit women? Why was the Iron Maiden, with its female form and cruel embrace, more marketable than the plain brutality of chains or whips? The answer lies not in history, but in obsession. For centuries, European culture turned the female body into a canvas of contradiction, celebrated as sacred, condemned as sinful, adorned with jewels, confined in iron. To imagine a torture chamber shaped like a woman's body was to merge violence with desire. To sexualize cruelty itself. In exhibitions across Europe, the Iron Maiden became a centerpiece, drawing crowds who gasped not only at its spikes, but at the feminine silhouette carved into its shell. In a way, the Maiden was never about execution. It was theater, a stage prop in which men could project their fears, their fantasies, their control, And in crafting this myth, they revealed a deeper truth. Women did not have to be tortured in reality for their suffering to be consumed. It could be imagined, displayed, sold as entertainment. The irony is bitter. While tourists whispered about maids crushed within spiked coffins, real women suffered in silence from devices that needed no myth to terrify. The breast ripper tore flesh from bone. The pair of anguish destroyed wombs and voices. The iron corset reshaped life into unending torment. The scold's bridle turned laughter into blood. These were not legends. They were facts, recorded in town chronicles, preserved in legal codes, described in grim detail by witnesses. Yet, somehow history chose to remember the invented maiden more vividly than the real devices. Perhaps because the Iron Maiden was distant, safely unreal, while the reality was too intimate, too cruel, too targeted. It is easier to fear a coffin of spikes than to confront the image of a young girl forced to cook meals while iron bands crushed her ribs. Easier to believe in fantasy than to acknowledge a widow gagged with iron for daring to argue with a neighbor. The maiden may have been false, but the structures that made her believable were terrifyingly real. So why does the myth endure? Why do we still whisper about Iron Maidens, carve them into fiction, display them in museums? Perhaps because the image resonates with something society has never truly reckoned with: the ease with which women's suffering is turned into performance. In the medieval square, torture was a show. In the Enlightenment Museum, it was an exhibit. Today, it is a tourist attraction, but beneath the myth lies a truth we cannot afford to forget. The real devices, breast rippers, pairs of anguish, bridles, corsets, were not tools of random madness. They were engineered, sanctioned, and applied with precision. They were aimed at women because society feared their voices, their choices, their power to create. Each device sent a message that breath, speech, fertility, and nurture, the very essence of womanhood, were not sacred, but dangerous. And that control, even through cruelty, was necessary. Cages of iron may rust, spikes may dull, but the ideology that forged them lingers in subtler forms. The myth of the Iron Maiden survives not because it was real, but because its shadow still speaks to us. It reminds us how easily violence can be turned into spectacle, how silence can be praised as virtue, how submission can be reshaped into law. The final lesson is not about the devices themselves, but about forgetting. For when we dismiss them as curiosities, when we reduce them to legends or museum displays, we erase the women who endured them. We silence their voices once more. Picture the maiden one last time, tall, hollow, silent. Her doors open, waiting. Inside, not spikes, but echoes. The screams of women whose pain was real, though their cage was not. The breast ripper's claws, the pair's silent bloom, the corset's breathless grip, the bridle's cruel spike. These were the true Iron Maidens, not imagined, but lived. What does it say about us that we created a myth just to imagine women inside such a cage? Perhaps that we never needed the device itself. The performance was always enough. The iron rusts. The stone crumbles, but the silence remains.